I'm Afshin Rattansi, and you're watching a special edition of Going Underground from the Iranian embassy in London as Britain and the United States send their soldiers to the Persian Gulf. Ambassador, thank you so much for inviting us into the embassy. I've got to ask you, Jeremy Hunt, the British Foreign Secretary, says that he is almost certain. Donald Trump says you saw the boat at night trying to take the mine off and successfully took the mine off the boat, and that was exposed. What did you make of the video imagery and the pictures we have here, proving almost certainly that the Iranian government was involved in explosions on tankers in the Persian Gulf?
They know themselves that these pictures don't prove what they are claiming. In fact, they are saying that we have an assessment, but the question is the assessment should be based on facts and evidences. These pictures that have been released are very distorted, and you cannot get any conclusion out of it. We, as Iran, would be very delighted to be part of an international investigation that we would, in fact, professionally get the matter, in fact, considered and really look at the evidences, because we know that they are in the region, they have sophisticated equipment, they can have very clear images from what has happened before the fire, after the fire, and the many incidents that are not clear in these pictures. So we would be very much supporting a neutral and thoroughly investigation into the issue. But as we have said, this is unfortunately part of a dirty politics, and unfortunately the people who want to drag the United States into a military confrontation are making these kind of assessments to support a confrontation, but let me be very clear that these are just fabrications.
Well, my understanding is an investigation is called for by many countries of the international community, including Germany and other countries, let alone Beijing, Moscow, and so on. Why do you think Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary of Britain, though, says it's almost certain? And why do you think Britain has immediately reacted by sending in our Royal Marines, let alone the United States sending 1,000 troops to the Persian Gulf?
As you know, this week is very crucial in the UK domestic policy because they are going to select a prime minister. So some of the issues that are raised here are out of some domestic policy considerations. But we, as I said, we are fully ready to look at the evidences that are provided by the US or by the UK. And I'm sure that when we would sit together and consider it very professionally, it would be very clear that they are not evidences, they are just analysis and maybe some political considerations.
Okay, well, aside from the British political leadership crisis, which is evident, when this was supposed to be taking place, and it was a Japanese vessel, because there appears to be contradictions from the Japanese owner, Yukitaka Katada, the CEO of one of the owners, saying they were flying objects. I understand that the Prime Minister of Japan was in Tehran at the same time, which hasn't perhaps given that much publicity. So the allegation is that Iran blew up a Japanese tanker while Shinzo Abe was in Tehran.
Unfortunately, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was planning to come to Tehran, there were a kind of sabotage policy to make this travel a failure, because immediately after the announcement, the final announcement that the date was confirmed, in fact, the United States was venturing into imposing new sanctions against Iran immediately after the confirmation of the date of the Prime Minister coming to Tehran. And when he was in Tehran, there were quite antagonistic statements by the US officials here and there. And unfortunately, at the time that he was meeting our supreme leader, which was considered a very important meeting, at that time, this incident for the oil tankers was happened. These are very suspicious, and unfortunately, the reality is that, in fact, there were some efforts to sabotage diplomacy behind the scenes.
It's not a double-double play, because people would ask, Why would you do that while Shinzo Abe was in town after 41 years? As has been said on mainstream channels, we heard from the Iranian government that they would respond to increasing economic warfare, as it were, against Iran, currently being waged by the United States, let alone perhaps the European Union.
Exactly. As you pointed out, the crux of the problem is this economic terrorism waged by the United States, not only against Iran, but it is against Russia, against China, against European countries, against India just recently. Unfortunately, sanctions, which should be a tool for very limited foreign policy issues when we have international coalition, international consensus, it's unfortunately done by the US not out of very clear consideration when there is a mandate by the Security Council, but it's a unilateral measure by the United States, in fact, to undermine the economic activities here and there. Unfortunately, not only it's not a policy anymore, it's like a habit. And even more than that, it's like a disease that the United States unilaterally imposing sanctions over so many countries around the globe, because they have the illusion that they have the upper hand over any country. So they are venturing into imposing sanctions against big countries like Russia, like China, like India, and European countries. This should be rectified. Otherwise, we cannot have an international economic order based on the fair competition. Unfortunately, the reality is that we are facing with the disease in the White House. And now we see that there is a tendency by the major countries. We have the summit between President Putin and the President of China, and we have other engagements at the world level that they would try to, in fact, diminish the influence of the US dollar over the international market. That's a determination that we see with the major powers in the even European Union. The reality is that the people around the world are very anxious and are very angry about the policy of the United States, that in fact they want to pressurize all countries to be in line with their policies.
I'll get to the oil price implications in a second, but when you were one of the negotiators of the JCPOA nuclear deal with the P5+1, weren't opponents of you even participating in those negotiations saying, don't trust them, there's no point in being a negotiator? Aren't they vindicated? Weren't you wrong?
As you said, now there is an understanding that why Iran should again negotiate with a country that in fact has shown to the international world that there is no trust into them, because they have withdrawn from an agreement that was considered as a great achievement of diplomacy at the international level. So there is no trust anymore in a government that sees no value in keeping its commitments. So there is unfortunately a very lack of confidence and in many circles in the world now.
But of course, I understand there was a fatwa against nuclear weapons made by Ayatollah Khamenei quite a while ago. You've watched how countries like Libya and so on, who have suspended nuclear weapons programs, which I know that Iran rejects, they get attacked and overthrown, and there is then widespread regional instability. What can possibly protect Iran without nuclear weapons from the superpower you just explained, the policies of a superpower you just explained?
We are now relying more on our national capacities, because we have a determination people who want to be independent, and we have armed forces who are very powerful to defend the country. And now we have a very great consensus among all our strata in the country, between the government, people, and the armed forces, that we are prepared for any eventuality. And that is the only element that we can rely, that we can resist against the policies of the United States. Unfortunately, the reality is that international norms and regulations are not implemented as it should be. So you cannot really rely that, in fact, you will be protected by the international organizations which have been established to protect countries against the dominance of major powers. The reality is that you should be powerful, but we are not, as some people believe, we are not relying that we would have nuclear weapons. We don't see nuclear weapons as a protection against the country. We think that we should be powerful economically, we should be powerful militarily, and we should have a unified position in the country itself. So we think that this is the timing that we have a coalition, a strong coalition between all forces, all political forces in the country, that we should resist against the policies of the United States and defend ourselves in the best manner.
You see, Britain and the United States back Israel ever more militarily with weapons. And the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has revealed that Israel has more than 100 nuclear warheads. How can Iran protect itself against, say, an Israeli attack, let alone a US or British attack on your country?
Using nuclear weapons is not an easy political issue. It's not only a military issue, it has political dimensions. Israel is equipped with nuclear weapons, but the reality is that, for example, Israel cannot resolve its differences with the other countries through the threat of nuclear weapons. They are now very paralyzed, even with the resistance that the Palestinians are exerting over, in fact, the Israeli policies.
Did you not find it strange when you were negotiating the JCPOA over what you and the Iranian government maintained was a civil nuclear program, that there was another country that had nuclear weapons in the Middle East, in the region, that wasn't being part of the JCPOA negotiations?
We didn't care about the policies of other countries. We have a very solid, in fact, foreign policy principles, and we believe that while we are a country which has been adhering to our commitments under the NPT and making all the available access to the IAEA to investigate and also monitoring all our nuclear activities.
Yeah, but they're not monitoring Israel, so are they?
That is a discrimination that we have been always raising at the international level, that in fact Israel is rejecting all kind of monitoring of its facilities by the IAEA, and that is a demand by the countries in the region, that Israel is the only entity in the region who is rejecting all of its international initiatives for disarmament, be it nuclear disarmament, in fact, and other measures of disarmament. And that's a reality, and we should rectify this, and we should pressurize against Israel to, in fact, to renounce its nuclear option. That's a thing that we are pursuing, and we are discussing with other countries in the region, and there are frustration over many countries in the region that Israel continues to be adamant of the international demands. That's a reality, unfortunately.
Ambassador, I'll just stop you there. More from the Iranian ambassador to Britain after this break. Welcome back. You're watching a special edition of Going Underground from the Iranian Embassy in London with Iran's ambassador to Britain. What did you make of Mohammed bin Salman saying the international community, and this is again about these tanker attacks, should take a firm stand towards an exponential regime that supports terrorism and spreads killing and destruction? This is the British-backed government of Saudi Arabia.
Unfortunately, the reality is that Saudi Arabia has been so much negatively interfering in all domestic affairs of many countries in the region. And the reality is that because of the support of the Trump administration, Mohammed bin Salman is very confident that he would be supported in all its negative decisions. They are, in fact, meddling into the situation in Lebanon. As you know, they, in fact, had problems with Prime Minister Hariri, and the incident that happened is well known. They are at a very all-out war with the poorest country in the world, Yemen, killing so many innocent people and creating the most dangerous humanitarian situation in the world. Millions of people are fully under distress in Yemen. and they don't have any vision how they can finish the war there. And in other parts of the region, they have not been able to come up with initiatives to reach to a friendly relations with other countries. They have made blockade against Qatar. They have, in fact, now interfering with Sudanese developments, which the people in Sudan are very angry about this. Unfortunately, this is the behavior that we are seeing on a daily basis. And we hope that they would change their policy. They would understand that this would not be leading to a helpful situation. They should change their policy. They should respect the policies of other countries and try to resolve their differences through negotiations.
Yes, but if we were talking about Iran trying to protect itself, what has Iran been able to do when it comes to protecting Yemen, as you say, the world's worst humanitarian crisis now threatening 20 million people? Very little. Have you spoken to the British counterparts? Because, of course, the Royal Air Force is training the warplane pilots to bomb Yemen at the moment.
That's a very unfortunate situation, and we have encouraged always the British government that they should stop sending armaments to the Saudis and Emiratis, because these weapons are used against the innocent Yemeni people. And we hope that, in fact, really there would be a coalition among the arm exporters to stop exporting arms to the region. And we continue our efforts at the UN level and try to encourage other countries in the region to build that coalition, which is necessary. Reality is that we have been even trying to make a coalition that we would send humanitarian assistance to the Yemeni people, but unfortunately these assistance are intercepted or in fact confiscated, and they are forced to change their course, not to reach to the Yemeni ports. The situation is very dangerous there. And,
of course, Britain is a big donor. I'm sure the British Foreign Office will be quick to remind all of us. But now we have a state where the news agenda has moved on a little more from these photographs, and we hear that Iran's stockpile limit is going to be breached under the terms of the JCPOA. What did you make of the way it was even being reported, that now your country is violating the terms of the JCPOA, or is about to?
If we would be very literally say that JCPOA has been already violated so many times by the United States, by European countries, because they have not been able to come up with their obligations. So
How did Britain violate the JCPOA before Donald Trump did?
Because they were supposed to enter into no ordinary economic relationship with Iran, but the UK companies have not been able to come up with those ordinary relationship, because they have not been supported by the UK government sufficiently, because in fact they are exposed to the US sanctions, and the banks have been barred to have any relationship with Iran, and the government, which should ensure that its companies and financial institutions be able to have ordinary relationship, has not been working. So the responsibility is with the government. So they understand.
And yet Iran just continued with the JCPOA even before Donald Trump violated it.
That's because we have announced that either we have a full implementation or another scenario which is enshrined in the JCPOA, which is partial implementation. Okay? Now that every party believes that full implementation is not possible because of the US sanctions, we would go along with the partial implementation. So we are determined to lower some of the commitments and suspend some of the implementation of our commitments to allow that we need to reach to an understanding that if partial implementation is satisfying everybody, okay, we would be also doing the same thing after 1 year of patience. So this is a very serious issue, and it's a demand of our people that you cannot continue implementing the JCPOA in full while other parties are not implementing the JCPOA.
Okay, well, The markets are now interested in oil prices. I don't know what it feels like as an ambassador in this country watching the NATO nation media channels, which one could be forgiven for believing, present the idea Iran is isolated. Do you think the fact that your president was in Bishkek for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, meeting with Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi and Imran Khan and others, is there a plan to leave the financial system that the United States seems to be using to strangle the economy of your country?
The reality is that because of the dominance of the U.S. on the media, when U.S. has a problem with a country, that country is attacked and marginalized and tried to be isolated. But the reality is that we have very good relationship with our neighboring countries. We have very good relationship with Russia, with China, with India and Pakistan. We have exchange of presidents and summit meetings. We have a very good friend relationship with Iraq, with the Central Asian countries, as you said, in Bishkek, in Tajikistan.
But oil is traded in dollars.
The reality is that this is a phenomenon that we are facing at the international level. We know that even European countries are conscious about this fact that this is a problem for everybody, that they are very much vulnerable to the, in fact, influence of US dollar. We know that many countries are working very seriously that how they can rectify this. China and Russia as the major countries, and also India very recently, and so many other countries are thinking that how they can make their trade relationship through not US dollar, but through the national currencies. We have had a number of initiatives agreed with other countries like India, Pakistan, and Turkey, and some others, Russia and China, that we can use our national currencies, and we should not be allowing that US dollar's dominance would, in fact, have its negative impacts over the economic relationship. So there are quite a number of very good initiatives. I tell you that dominance of the US dollar is diminishing. I don't know how much time is needed that we would have a quite different economic environment, but I tell you that it has started, and that would be the cost of the US paying for withdrawing from the JCPOA particularly.
And I've got to ask, just finally, about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who worked for BBC Media Action and has been imprisoned in Iran as a spy. I think she's been made a diplomat by the British Foreign Service now. Do you think the BBC is involved in regime change with its outlets, whether it be BBC Action training journalists in different countries, or they have a channel, BBC Persian, that gives a very different view of Iran than, say, Press TV, Iran's broadcast organization, currently banned here in Britain, of course?
Yes, as you know, BBC is the broadcasting institute in the UK. It's in fact is supported by the government in terms of expenditures, in terms of, in fact, they gather their money through the public funds. That's very clear. So their policies are very much.
They deny editorial content is
editorial. I
by
understand it. Editorial is something very, very detailed, but the question is the policies. When there are upper institutions who direct your policies, they don't care about the editorial. Editorial is up to the people to think about it and arrange for it. But the question is the policies. BBC has a very negative history in Iran because they have been also involved when there was a coup d'etat against the national government of Iran. It's recorded, and the BBC has...
In 1953.
Yes, and the BBC has produced a program on this. They know very clear about this. But apart from that, Nazanin is a lady, has been, in fact, been engaged in illegal activities. She has been tried in Tehran by the judiciary, and she has 5 years in prison. We are very sorry about this because she's a lady and she has a small kid. We know that also the husband is very distressed because the family is in Tehran.
He's hunger striking out there, yeah.
Yes. But the reality is that you should always, if you want to change the situation, you should go through the legal processes that existed. Pressurizing our embassy here, blocking the entrance of the embassy, preventing the people to go and come into the embassy building is not resolving.
Well, we have freedom of protest here on any issue, LGBT rights, every issue. I've got to ask you then, is the Iranian government going to train journalists, British journalists here, who want to get regime change here in Britain?
No, because in fact we are maybe not agreeing with their policies, but we are not detaining them. We are not, in fact, harassing any people working for news agencies. But the reality is that, unfortunately, there are a campaign of fake news, particularly in the UK. There are.
You're not losing that information war, as your Press TV, which was the Iranian equivalent, I suppose, of the BBC in a way, the state-mandated broadcaster, that's banned in this country. And as you say, the BBC and, I don't know, other organizations clearly seem to suggest that these images in this video do point to Iran being the perpetrator of violence in the Persian Gulf.
Yes, unfortunately, that's a reality that some of the news are very unfair to Iran. We expect that the news would be fair and all voices in the news would be heard in the UK. Not only that, for example, the countries like Saudi Arabia were buying some big shares in the, media.
The local Evening Standard London newspaper.
Exactly. And also they have established Iran International is an institution which has been created by the Saudi Arabia. In fact, this is not fair that they would really trying to influence the Persian-speaking networks through fake news and through the foreign interferences, in fact, to have a distorted vision about what's happening in Iran. So we should allow other also media to have a voice, and we would have a very correct reality of what's happening in Iran.
Ambassador, thank you. And that's it for this episode of Going Underground from the Iranian Embassy in London. We'll be back on Saturday as the race to be the next British Prime Minister continues here in this country. See you on Saturday.